Hi folks, you were Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for joining this presentation. In this essay I'd like to talk about the quality of generalship from World War I, and this was motivated or stimulated or whatever by a short video I saw from a channel I follow called History Debunked, and the idea put forward on that channel, or in that video rather, was that the British generals, particularly the senior generals, and namely Field Marshal Haig, that they were being misrepresented as being useless, incompetent, and so on, and that this was an indication that the British generalship in World War One was, to say the least, substandard or subpar. Now, let's have a look at. I've actually done quite a lot of work on this. I did a lot of research for an article I wrote some time ago for a magazine, and actually put it together as a book, and I got quite a lot of interest actually in publishing it from publishers. But we quibbled over the maps and the various information. They didn't want to have maps in it, and didn't want to have spot colour on any of the maps that they were prepared to agree to. And I thought the maps were critical to understanding battles and the details of battles. So the whole thing ended up not proceeding. I think with hindsight I should have just folded and given them whatever they wanted. At least I'd then be a recognised published author. But anyway, coming back to the idea, was the British generalship, or in particularly Field Marshal Haig, was it, he was named as the Butcher and this sort of thing, that there was due to his generalship, there was a huge unnecessary loss of life of the soldiers on the battlefront, and that this should be, thus the generals, the guys in charge and so on, should be held accountable for those battle losses. The German generals and commentators and observers were also surprised that the British were prepared to sustain considerable losses without really achieving anything, and that was considered as unusual. So, as with all things, it's not simply an absolute, or many things rather, it's not an absolute. Was the general 100% useless or 100% superb? Or it doesn't go that way. It's somewhere in between. It's far more nuanced than that. Those generals have to operate under certain conditions and circumstances, and also you're looking at the relative effectiveness of a military force. It doesn't matter if you've got a pretty good outfit. If the other guy's got an even better outfit, then it's not going to turn out so well. So let's have a look at the generalship of World War One, and examine, was the British generalship wanting or substandard or poor quality? Is the idea that Haig was some sort of a butcher in terms of loss of life and so on? Let's look at that. The propaganda suggests that he was utterly incompetent, and this is not really true. But there's certain sort of merit in saying that the generalship wasn't up to par. So let's go through this anyway. When World War One broke out, the German army was quite clearly the best army in the world. The Japanese in the 1880s or 1870s had sent a sort of a commission of exploration around the world to look at which countries were the best performing in what areas of not only military activity but also industry and so on, and they were pretty impartial observers, and they came away with that the British Navy was the most impressive of the day, and that the German army, which was of a Germany that only recently had federated in the 1870s, that the German army was, or Prussian army, I guess you probably more call it at the time, was clearly the most impressive in terms of a land-based military force. And they covered a number of areas, the Japanese. They looked at the quality of the weaponry, the artillery, the rifles, etc., the training, the logistics of moving troops around, the use of railway networks to get troops from A to B, and the supply and logistical machines, but also particularly the planning and the willingness to look at and incorporate new technology and the newest emerging technologies into the weaponry that could be decisive at the battlefront. So the Japanese came away saying these guys, the Germans, were miles ahead of anyone else, and it was an observation that was quite keen, I thought, because when World War One broke out, this was immediately apparent in the battlefield. So the German plan in World War One was. They had the biggest, most professional, best trained army in Europe. So the sort of feeling was that, well, we've got the best army. Why don't we use it? And the feeling was that they could win battles, win a war if that were to be a European war. They could win it fairly quickly, and they were really going off the Franco-Prussian War of the early 1870s. Where because they were able to move their troops to the key positions quickly with supplies and with so and so, with logistical logistical support and whatnot. Because they were able to do that, they prevailed in rather quickly actually in the Franco-Prussian War, and were able to also prevail in say the Austrian War, and looking at that, they presumed that if they could strike quickly, because they presumed they'd be fighting France and Russia at the same time, a correct assumption as it turned out. And so they planned around, well, we'll knock out the most dangerous enemy first, and because the Russians will take longer to mobilise their resources, because they've got a piss poor rail network, so we really need to knock out the French first, and then we can turn around and knock out the Russians at our leisure. That was the sort of the underlying assumption. Now that fell apart to some extent when World War One began, because the Russians mobilised a little bit more quickly than the Germans had anticipated, and started coming into Eastern Germany again a few weeks before the German planners had thought it was possible. And that the British were able to get more troops into France when World War One started than the German planners had imagined. These weren't sort of huge differences, I guess, in the overall scheme of things, but it just meant that the knockout blow the Germans thought they could deliver on in France was delayed, and to the point where they no longer had the resources to do it, given that resources had to be diverted to the east to fight the Russians, who mobilised more quickly than they'd imagined. But let's have a look at the generalship there. That's what caused the stalemate into the trench warfare in France, where both sides dug in on quite a long front, going hundreds of kilometres from the border of Switzerland right through to the Channel, the English Channel. It was a very long sort of. Now there were key areas of activity along the front where both sides had the best logistics for delivering troops and resources. So those were going to be the main battle areas for obvious reasons. But the casualties that all sides sustained, this is in the east, the warfare was relatively mobile. It didn't have the same trench warfare. Not the trenches weren't ever done, they were, but that idea of entrenched positions that barely moved for years, that didn't happen in the east. It was far more mobile, and the Germans were able to inflict very heavy casualties onto the Russians and score some very substantial military victories, but they still had to dedicate more resources to that front than they thought they would have to in the early stages of the war. Now, in terms of generalship in France, which is where Haig and the British troops come in, the examination that I did, I haven't dug out the stats to do this, so this is not a scripted talk I'm doing here. This is from memory and so on, but the overall delivery here is going to hold good. Is that if you look at the German troops deployed as versus British versus French and so on, if you look at the German troops deployed and the resources deployed to the whether it be economic or the amount of field artillery pieces or the amount of rifles or whatever it might be, if you look at those resources, the Germans were able to inflict far more casualties, if you will. I'll simplify it, here. Inflict far more casualties for every life lost and every dollar spent than either the French or the British did. So now, does that mean the British generalship was absolutely useless from top to bottom? No, it didn't mean that at all. It meant that the Germans were very good, and that's some, again, it's relative here. So that's a material point. The German general staff were much better trained, much better educated. They did come from an aristocracy, as in the Prussian landowning aristocracy type thing, von this and von that. But they didn't sort of backslide on the training. The training was rigorous. It was good quality training. It combined technology and planning, reconnaissance, logistics in a way that I don't believe, at least, that the French and the British training did, or certainly not to the same extent, quality or rigour. This meant that the British generals, unless they were particularly gifted, weren't in the... And you saw this in the Second World War as well. In fact, the gap in the quality of generalship had opened up even further by the Second World War. The British just looked like a bunch of bumbling amateurs compared to the German generals. Not in every case, but in many, in most. Now, again, this didn't mean that the British were useless. It meant that the Germans were much better. That was the difference. And now the French army was considered to be a very high quality army, but it still wasn't of the calibre of the Germans. So again, if you look at this ratio of dollars spent, lives lost to casualties inflicted, the Germans were looking pretty good. And given the economic forces arrayed against them, they should have been beaten much earlier in World War One. The fact they hung on for as long as they did was due to the quality of their generalship and their ability to inflict more casualties than they received for, again, each dollar spent. Now, there are a whole lot of things about that. When the war began, the British hadn't anticipated a war of machine guns and artillery. Sure, that it had been considered, and the British were innovators in machine guns. It wasn't like they didn't know. But the idea of trench warfare, the absolutely central position that the machine gun would play in the war, and the central position, or the very important position, that artillery would play. This was something that the British did underestimate, but the Germans were right on the ball for that. Not that any side had predicted the trench warfare, by the way, they hadn't. But the Germans were better prepared in their ratio of machine guns to men deployed and artillery pieces. There are also a number of other things. The quality of manufacture. The German machine guns didn't break down to the same extent that the British and French ones did. This wasn't this did change over the course of the war, by the way, but certainly initially the German machine guns could keep on going while the British ones had got too hot and had to stop, or they needed various field maintenance. And when you're in the middle of a battle, when the soldiers charging left, right, and centre, you've got to stop machine gunning while you have to pull out the screwdriver and do maintenance. I mean, you might as well not have a machine gun. You need reliable kit when you're out there in those sort of circumstances. And the German equipment was just more reliable. Again, overall, you can find exceptions. Other things too was the German equipment was interchangeable. They had very finely machined in good quality metallurgical terms. They had very finely machined down to micron level. So all their parts were interchangeable. So if they had for example, two machine guns or two pieces of artillery that are broken, maybe were damaged in some way, they could take the parts from one and put it in the other, and they would be completely interchangeable down to absolute precision fitting. Whereas, in the case of the French and the British ones, particularly the British, and again, more in the early stages of the war, the artillery and other equipment was made in different factories. Now, supposedly to the same specification, but it was just a few microns out. It was that little bit different. So that when you tried to move apart from one, supposedly the same piece of artillery or the same model, you tried to move apart from one to the other, you couldn't, because it just wouldn't fit. So those artillery pieces stood there unusable while they waited for spare parts, which could take weeks or even months in some cases. The Germans didn't have that same problem. They could put equipment that had been damaged or broken down, but because the parts were completely interchangeable, they could put equipment back in the line, back in use, back in the front lines far more quickly and far more frequently and regularly than the British or the French could. Now you may say, well, so what? No big deal. But when you can have as much as 50% of your equipment sitting there unusable because of some sort of damage, the firing pin or the this or the that or the that thing of ball bearings, but if you've got fully interchangeable parts, that one over there's got a broken wheel, but this one here's got a broken firing pin, so we can interchange that wheel and that firing pin, and then suddenly you've got both of those things back, or at least one of them back in action. And a lot of these things can be done by you don't need the fully qualified mechanic guy. A lot of them can be done just by a minimally trained field technician can do a lot, not all, but do a lot of these things. So you can have a cannon or an artillery piece that's out of action for 10 minutes and then it's back in the line, whereas the British situation, it could be out of commission for weeks, if not months, or permanently. So these things cumulatively, across many thousands or tens of thousands of pieces of equipment, they make a big difference. Now, also the Germans were far better at their logistical deliveries. The amount of times that the wrong bullets would arrive, or the wrong size this, or the wrong parts would be sent to the wrong place in the British and the French sort of situation. Bear in mind they had two languages to consider, and that would have added an overhead. Not every French soldier spoke English, or every English soldier spoke French, and that sort of stuff. So, but nonetheless, the amount of silly fiasco type mistakes that occurred on the British side didn't occur with anywhere near the same level of frequency on the German side. Better planning, better logistics, better organisation, better delivery, and of course all this again together makes a difference. Now, it was probably 1916 for the British fully caught up with the Germans in terms of the amount of artillery, the amount of shells, the amount of machine guns, and that sort of stuff. So they had 2 years where really the gap, that they had to make up, or did make up, the differential by loss of human life. Now let's compare the different generals on the Western Front, because the British had Canadian and Australian forces in decent numbers on the Western Front, and the noticeable thing there is the difference in the ratio of casualties to on those Canadian and Australian forces than occurred in the British sector. Now, the Canadian General Currie is an example, and there was another one, and I can't think of his name now. The Australian General Monash. Now, they in the British and British casualties inflicted to received compared to the Canadians and the Australians, there was quite a noticeable difference there. So the Canadians were able to inflict more casualties on a relative basis to those received than the British did. Same for the Australians. Now the Canadian and Australian forces were kind of semi-autonomous. You know, they had a Canadian or an Australian general in charge, but the overall, you know, strategic high command was still British. But it's quite plain that they were doing things differently, and they were sustaining. Not that they didn't sustain casualties, they did, but they sustained less casualties again relative to resources employed, and were able to inflict more casualties relative to resources employed, soldiers, you know, for every dollar and so on. So it indicated the different sorts of generalship, not necessarily at strategic level, but certainly at the local sort of tactical level, differences in generalship, and then preparedness to look at, okay, how can we do this differently? How can we modify our tactics down to the micro level even, to change outcomes in terms of the casualties and the results and so on. Now the British sort of seem to rely quite heavily on, I think, the Victorian era of, you know, the dash of, you know, the pluck of the British soldier going out there, bayonet pointing and walking fearlessly into the torrent of bullets. Now, when you've got you know, single shot musket rifles and, you know, those sort of things, you can probably do that, or the British did do it. But once you've got repeating rifles and machine guns, that changes the entire, you know, human life result, you know, to commitment economics of the battle, whether it be human life economics or the economics of the resources you're employing. And this was something that I think in the early days of the war, this idea of, you know, remember, these are all people who've been trained on, you know, like walk into the hail of bullets with your bayonet pointing out front, the cavalry charge, and, you know, this sort of stuff. Not that they hadn't recognised that warfare had changed, they had, they knew that, but letting those old habits die. So the idea of jumping up out of the trenches and charging down the enemy while you're screaming and shouting and waving your bayonet, that doesn't really count for that much when you know, you've got machine guns everywhere you look, shooting the crap out of anything that moves. Now, on top of that, the Germans were experts at defence in depth. So, you know, ideas of rows of trenches with resources held on the third or fourth trench, so that if a bayonet charge did somehow manage to make it through to a front line, that there would be immediate counterattacks which would recover the trench. And once there's mobility and movement, that's when you tend to lose control of a battle. So that when the bayonet charge secures the enemy's first trench, you're now beyond your own resources. And so where does the follow-up resources, where do you put extra numbers into the into the battle in order to secure and exploit the breakthrough that you've made? And the enemy can then, in this case the German defence in depth, they can then quickly counterattack and quickly recover their positions, which is why the front line never really moved, this defence in depth. So decisive breakthroughs were very difficult to achieve. Now, the Germans did experiment with different ways of fighting. If something didn't work, they would go back to, they go back to the drawing board, and they're prepared to say, all right, what else can we do? How can we do this differently? Now, the Germans would look at it in terms of incremental tactical advantage, whereas the Allies, if you look at the Allies, they were always, well, not always, but particularly they were, and under political pressure to do this, by the way, the likes of the Hague and Supreme Command, they tended to look at what we want, a super strategic masterstroke, that one big button push that's going to change it all and turn it all around. And they were constantly looking for that. Churchill was someone who was always making that mistake, the huge strategic masterstroke. Whereas in reality, the Germans were prepared to look. Okay, well, if we have soldiers, that have 2 guns or 2 rifles, if we have soldiers that are doing, if we train them to do that. All right, let's give grenades. Let's throw the grenades first, then do this. So they were really planning down to the micro level of, the next step beyond the hand-to-hand combat almost, and saying that this could, because of the trench warfare and the dug-in sort of positions, if we make these micro changes in aggregation, we can have a decisive advantage. They're prepared to look at those sorts of things far more so, certainly from what I've observed, than the British or the French did, or even the Russians for that matter. So was the British generalship utterly and totally incompetent? Well, I don't think so. Were they as good as the Germans? No, definitely not. Was their equipment, later on it became so, but was their equipment as good as the German equipment? No. Was their logistical machine as good? No. Was their reconnaissance and organisational machine as good? No. So they just weren't as good as the enemy. That's all it was. And were they utterly incompetent? I don't think so. Did they make some bad decisions and do some dumb things? And were they probably a little bit careless with human life in the sense that the casualties were massive all around, by the way. Were they, did they assume that just charging down trenches was the way to go? Well, they did make those assumptions and they were wrong. Easy to look at that in hindsight. At the time, they were thinking, well, what else can we do? What other option is there? And this is something that we need to take into account, particularly given the attitudes of the day. But the French and British empires, economically and materially, and in terms of their access to population resources, again, they should have won fairly easily and quickly against the Germans. But the German military machine was just that much better that they couldn't be easily defeated in the field, and that came across. So on a relative basis, the British were made to look amateurish and incompetent because the Germans were so much better. You've been with Tassos today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.